Woo! And I guess, and we're off. So, in a town hall on CNN, while still the president, Barack Obama was asked by a Gold Star mother why he refused to say Islamic terrorism. The short version of his response was this: there is no doubt, and I've said it repeatedly, where we see terrorist organizations like Al-Qaeda and ISIL, they have perverted and distorted and tried to claim the mantle of Islam for an excuse for basically barbarism and death. Going on, he said, what I've been careful about when I describe these issues is to make sure we do not lump these murderers into the that exist around the world, including in this country, who are peaceful, who are responsible, who in the country are fellow troops and police officers and firefighters and teachers and neighbors and friends, end quote. I agree with the President Obama, and from his response, I believe these are the points he was trying to make. One, Al-Qaeda and ISIL hold different views from those traditional Muslims who practice Islam as a religion of peace. Two, it is important to distinguish between those who are peaceful and those who favor extreme changes within the religion of Islam. Three, the vast majority of Muslims around the world and in our country do not advocate the extreme measures that groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIL take in order to achieve their agenda. Simply put, groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIL endorse extremism as a way of achieving their political goals. This is not how the majority of people who practice Islam are. I could speculate, but I do not believe that anyone disagrees with these points, which brings me to the topic of this debate. Obama should have used the phrase radical Islamic terrorism as president. And my first point is tied right along with my first definition, which is radical. Merriam-Webster gives 4 definitions of the word radical that fit this context. 1, very different from the usual or traditional. 2, favoring extreme changes in existing views, habits, conditions, or institutions. 3, associated with political views, practices, and policies of extreme change. 4, advocating extreme measures to retain or restore a political state of affairs. Everything President Obama expressed in his response of why he would not say radical Islamic terrorism can be seen in the 4 definitions of the word radical, thus making Al-Qaeda and ISIL, by definition, radical wings of the Islamic religion. So my first point is this: Obama should have used the phrase radical Islamic terrorism as president, because the definition of radical encompasses everything he feels as Al-Qaeda and ISIL represent in regards to the religion of Islam. Neglecting to use the word, but almost stating the definition verbatim, is intellectually dishonest and treats the viewers and listeners of his speeches like we are not capable of understanding that not everyone who practices Islam also practices radical extremism. 23 seconds left. This should be awesome. I am looking forward to this. Those are my opening statements, and I will pass as soon as I can figure this out.
Boom. All right, and off we go. All right, so here's my opening. It's a pleasure to be debating you today, Terrence, aka the People's Champion. Right, so to evaluate whether or not President Obama should say specific words, we need some criteria to which to consider the question should. The context of the words radical Islamic terrorism is the war on terror. This is a conflict between civilized world, including the US and its allies, fighting against international terrorist and insurgent groups who generally claim to be fighting for Islam. The president's words in this context should serve the interests of the civilized world in fighting terrorism. His choice of words was part of a deliberate strategy to fight this war. Therefore, strategic is the value that this debate should rest on today. Your criteria today as judges is this: would Obama saying the words radical Islamic terrorism instead of the words that he normally uses, which is generally radical terrorism or radical extremists, does that represent a wise strategy in pursuing the war against terrorism? To win, Pro must show us that Obama saying these specific words is a wise strategy that will help us in the war on terror. If Pro cannot show this, they cannot meet their burden. Or if Con can show that it is counterproductive to a wise strategy, then Con wins. So that's the framework for today's debate. Let me address just a little bit of what Pro has said. I don't have a lot of responses so far. But he said that Al-Qaeda and ISIL are bad. That's right. They're not like normal Muslims. We agree with what Obama said in that context. His definition of radical is accepted. I think that's appropriate. I would point out, and I think he has more points to come. He had more than one, I'm sure, is that that Islam is really the key word here. Generally speaking, Obama did not want to use the word Islam along with the word terrorist or Islamic terrorists or Muslim terrorists. Even if you insert the word radical in there, he really wasn't in favor of that. He tended to use the words radical terrorism, radical extremists, international terrorism, things like that. And that's all part of his strategy, which I'm going to get into my next speech. But let's hear more from the People's Champion.
Oh, God. This is so much fun debating Siegfried again. Okay, so previously I spoke about the very definition of radical and how it fits the exact way in which President Obama spoke of terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS. Next, I want to talk about the legitimizing myth. There is this myth that by labeling ISIS as a radical Islamic terrorist organization, that this would somehow legitimize them on a world stage and rally Muslims to their cause. To that, I would ask this question. Which provides the greater opportunity to legitimize ISIS? Option 1, calling them a radical Islamic terrorist group, or option 2, the fact that Obama authorized 10 times more airstrikes on ISIS and Al-Qaeda targets than his predecessor. Still unsure? Okay, second one, which shows that the U.S. considers them a threat. Option 1, saying these groups are perverting the peaceful religion of Islam and are radical by definition, or option 2, the 1,126 drone strikes President Obama sanctioned in countries like Libya, Somalia, and Iraq, all places that are considered ISIS and Al-Qaeda strongholds. And in case you're still undecided, what goes more for building the sympathy for the cause of ISIS and Al-Qaeda? Option 1, saying radical Islamic terrorism, or option 2, the 120 civilian deaths reported in 2016 alone from those drone strikes from the U.S. government. You can say all day to your daughter, there are no such thing as monsters, but your storyline is gone at the moment your daughter watches you unload 100 rounds from a machine gun through the closet door. Okay, so which ties into reason 2, Obama should have used the phrase radical Islamic terrorism, which is because it is important to identify your enemy. In June 2016, Democratic Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard from Hawaii, an Iraq War veteran, said in a CNN interview, "You know, I understand and appreciate the president's concern, which is he doesn't want all Muslims to be cast with the same targeting or the same look as the handful of radical jihadists, and I agree with that. This is why it is important to make the distinction. We need to be able to identify it in order to defeat this threat." She said the term radical Islamic terrorism was an important term to use because it makes a distinction between the vast majority of Muslims who are practicing their spiritual path and who appreciate and support a pluralistic society and government that's free, versus the small handful of people who, like ISIS and Al-Qaeda, believe that unless you abide by their caliphate and their theocracy, you should be killed. So in talking about what's strategic, okay, 39 seconds left. Okay, and talking about what's strategic in this global war on terrorism, it's been a hit or miss, many different things. Now, later on, I'll pull out the facts that you can say on one hand, you know what, I don't want to say radical Islamic terrorism and stuff like that, because that's going to go to legitimizing them, and that's going to rally people to their threat. But you can't say that on one hand, and on the other hand, drop thousands of bombs and kill hundreds of people. It's counterproductive to the whole thing. So that right there, like I said, it's a myth. It's not even true. It's just awesome talking points of the Democratic Party. And I'll pass.
All right, I'm going to extend my case a little bit and or build my case, and then I'll do some rebuttal. So Obama's strategic reasons for not using the word radical Islamic terrorism include the following points, which I'll explain in Obama's own. 1, they alienate moderate Islam. There is a need, this is Obama speaking, there is a need for Islam as a whole to challenge that interpretation of Islam, to isolate it, and to undergo a vigorous discussion within their community about how Islam works as a part of a peaceful modern society. I cannot persuade peaceful, tolerant Muslims to engage in that debate if I'm not sensitive about their concerns of being targeted with a broad brush. Number 2, those words feed into the terrorist narrative and recruiting. Again, Obama. Groups like ISIL and Al-Qaeda want to make this war about Islam and America, or between Islam and the West. They want to claim that they are the true leaders of over 1 billion Muslims around the world who reject their crazy notions. They want us to validate them by implying that they speak for those 1 billion+ people, that they speak for Islam. That's their propaganda. That's how they recruit. And if we fall into that trap of painting all Muslims with a broad brush, and we imply that they are at war with an entire region, then we are doing the terrorists' work for them. Number 3, they weaken our ability to gain allies. Obama, when you start calling these organizations Islamic terrorists, that's the way it's heard. The way it's received by our friends and allies around the world is that somehow Islam is terroristic. And then that makes them feel as if they're under attack. And in some cases, it makes it harder for us to get their cooperation in fighting terrorism. Number 4, those words do nothing to actually fight terrorism. Again, Obama. what exactly would using this label accomplish? What exactly would it change? Would it make ISIS less committed to trying to kill Americans? Would it bring in more allies? Is there a military strategy that's served by this? The answer is none of the above. Calling a threat by a different name does not make it go away. Not once has an advisor of mine said, man, if we could really use that phrase, we're going to turn this whole thing around. Not once. So let's talk about rebuttals. I got a minute left here. So legitimizing the myth. What is more important, he asks, the drone strikes that we do or the words that we choose? Well, it's an interesting point, a valid point, but not for this debate. This debate is whether or not Obama should have used the words radical Islamic terrorism as president. It is not about whether or not Obama should have done drone strikes or not. We can debate that in a different hour. The pro has got to show us that using those words has a strategic advantage. My point is to show you that using those words has a strategic disadvantage, or that there is no strategic advantage. And I think I've done that. Whether or not you do drone strikes or not is irrelevant. It is whether those choice of words are helpful or not helpful. I will respond to the point about identifying the enemy in my next post.
Hey, Siegfried, you're making me go out of order. The part you just had right now was like my next time. But okay, so reason 3, which is really my reason 4. Reason 3 that Obama should have used the phrase radical Islamic terrorism as president is because pretending that ISIS is not Islamic is dishonest and shows a strategic error in combating their ideology. The reality is that the Islamic State is Islamic, very Islamic. Yet it has attracted psychopaths and adventure seekers drawn largely from the disaffected populations of the Middle East and Europe. But the religion preached by its almost ardent followers derives from coherent and even learned interpretations of Islam. Virtually every major decision and law promulgated by the Islamic State adheres to what it calls in its press and pronouncements and on its billboards, license plates, stationery, and coins, the prophetic methodology, which means following the prophecy and example of Muhammad in great detail. Muslims can reject the Islamic State, nearly all do, but pretending that it isn't actually a religious group with theology that must be understood to be combated has already led to the United States to underestimate it and back foolish schemes to counter it, like failing to say radical Islamic terrorism. Okay, we'll need to get acquainted with the Islamic State intellectual genealogy if we are to react in a way that will not strengthen it. And I got that from an article in the Atlantic. Also, in the 2015, the New York Times published confidential comments by Major General Michael J. Nagata, the Special Operations Commander for the United States in the Middle East, admitting that he had hardly begun figuring out the Islamic State's appeal. We have not defeated the idea, he said. We do not even understand the idea. In the past year, President Obama has referred to the Islamic State variously as not Islamic and as Al-Qaeda's JV team, statements that have reflected confusion about the group and may have contributed to significant strategic errors. Okay, so that right there is saying that the President Obama, in the way he has referred to the Islamic State so far, has been a significant strategic error, and that is by one of the special operations commanders, a major general. So that is the show. Why my opponent can say that Obama said this and Obama said that. This is one article that was posted in the New York Times from a strategic commander, a special operations commander of the in the Middle East, who said that the way that Obama did it, in his words that he used, may have contributed to significant strategic errors in combating ISIS. So with that, I'll go ahead and pass back to my opponent.
Sure. Let's talk about identifying the enemy first. So again, I'm going to use Obama's own words as a response. I'll follow that up with mine. So Obama says this: so someone seriously thinks that we don't know who we're fighting? If there's anyone out there who thinks we're confused about who the enemies are, that would come as a big surprise to the thousands of terrorists we've taken off the battlefield. That would come as a surprise to those who've spent the last 7.5 years dismantling the Al-Qaeda, including the men and women in uniform who put their lives at risk, and then the special forces that I ordered to go get bin Laden, who are now on the ground in Iraq and Syria. They know full well who the enemy is, and so does everybody else. There's no confusion that the terrorists out there claim to be fighting for Islam. That's not like a mystery in anybody's mind, right? The point, the strategic decision not to use radical Islamic terrorism is to not lump those guys in with the 1.8 billion Muslims, most of whom are peaceful and are not committing terrorist acts out there in the world. We want to ostracize these guys. We want to alienate these guys. We want to separate them from everybody else. And the purpose, identifying your enemy, who we well understand who our enemy are, would be completely useless. I mean, I'm not persuaded at all that that's something that we need to do or is going to have any kind of strategic effect. However, using those words together does create the problem that I talked about, and how not using those words helps fight against the terrorist narrative that they are all of Islam fighting against the West. That's not what we want people to think, because that's not what the truth is. All right, so let's talk about pretending that ISIS is not an Islamic problem. Obama does not pretend that ISIS is not a bunch of people that claim to be Islamic. He acknowledges that. I've read many interviews with him. He's even said the word Islamic terrorists. He just doesn't say it in his public speeches. He says it in private conversations and interviews, because he does understand who they are. But when you're a president and you give a public speech, you're giving a public message that not only is the American public going to read, but leaders around the world in Muslim countries and the populations of Muslim countries are going to see these words. So he's being very specific, very careful, and very strategic in his choice of words. He's not making believe or pretending anything. And if the generals do not understand who we are fighting, if this strategic commander, whoever he is confused about who the terrorists are and what their faith is, I'm shocked, because I think that's patently aware of just about everybody who they are. They're terrorists, they're killers, they're murderers. They claim to be Islamic, but they are very different from the Muslims that are part of the American military forces, who are our brothers and our friends and our co-workers, and who are peaceful, billions of peaceful people around the world. So I think that's ridiculous.
Okay, during 2016 presidential election, the people of the United States spoke, and they spoke loudly. States that had been Democratic strongholds for decades turned red. Michigan, which had been blue every election since 1988, turned red. Pennsylvania had been blue since 1988. Also, it turned red. Minnesota had been blue since 1972. It turned red. Now, let me explain to you what this has to do with the resolution at hand. So when people who had been lifetime Democratic voters were asked why they had switched parties and decided to vote Republican, two answers were given overwhelmingly. One, they did not really trust Hillary Clinton. Understood. And the second one was Trump was politically correct, and he spoke to the hearts and minds of the people and sounded like the people. In short, Democratic voters voted for Trump because they felt that he had their best interests at heart. Interests like jobs, immigration, and yes, the war on terrorism. Case in point, a Rasmussen poll in November 2015 revealed this: 60% of likely U.S. voters believe the United States was at war with radical Islamic terrorism. 56% of Democrats, 70% of Republicans, and 54% of independent believe America was at war with radical Islamic terrorism. That is majority in every major voting party saying we are at war with not terrorism, not radical terrorism, but radical Islamic terrorism. Of those polled, a staggering 92% of all voters regarded radical Islamic terrorism as a serious threat to the United States. So when you have the president of the United States, who is the senior elected official of the Democratic Party, and he chooses to be politically correct over just being correct, it makes the entire Democratic Party look dishonest. The voters aren't stupid. Of the poll I just stated, what I left out was this: while 56% of Democrats believe America was at war with the radical Islamic terrorism, 65% of Democrats agreed with the president that ISIS does not represent the true beliefs of Islam. If he had only been honest, perhaps so many Democrats would not have jumped ship and voted Republican. And of course, that right there was a 95% level of confidence on that. So what I want to bring up, 59 seconds left. So far, I have a major general who said that Obama's method, his verbiage, shows significant strategic errors. Second, I showed you the definition of radical actually separates the two sides, those who are mainstream and those who are radical, just like ISIS and Al-Qaeda. And then I showed you that a congresswoman said that those words, that using the words radical Islamic terrorism, would actually go to serve a better purpose for us. And so far, my opponent, all he showed is he's dug in deep and showed more of what Obama said. So while on one hand, 23 seconds left, while on one hand, my opponent can keep saying Obama said this and Obama meant this, I've started to show you that while Obama feels this and says this, that everyone around him, the Democratic Party, Democratic congressmen, Democratic voters, a major general in the military, all said that one, Obama showed strategic error in what he was doing by failing to say, and
all right. Hillary Clinton didn't win the election. Not a shocker necessarily, but we can't draw a conclusion about the fact that he didn't say the words radical Islamic terrorism was the cause of the election loss. Or there's no causal link that we can show that that's definitely why why she lost the election. Maybe if Obama had run again, he might have won the election for third term if that was legal. But that wasn't the case. We don't really know exactly any single issue or any single point that did it. It was Hillary Clinton versus Trump, and apparently Trump came out the victor. Now, beyond that fact, because I like to clash, so I'll try to shoot it down for that reason. But also, look, what's the strategic impact? Our value for this debate is strategy. And the valuing decision is whether or not Obama saying the words radical Islamic terrorism represents wise strategy in the pursuit of the war on terror. That's got nothing to do with the election that followed up. So, if you can show what it has to do with the war on terror, be very interested. But until you can, it doesn't fit into our value criteria today, which hasn't really been challenged in this debate. So that's what we're going with. We're talking about strategy. Now, again, you talked about your general. You got his general quote, and that's cool. But what exactly does he say about the word, and what strategic outcome was it, right? What impact does that general claim actually had? He said, maybe mistakes were made, right? Maybe? What mistakes? That's not really, what we call a strong argument, right? Like, he's humming and hawing. Maybe he likes the words radical Islamic terrorism, but he hasn't told us what the strategic impact would be if Obama had said that. If Obama had said that, how would that help us win the war on terror? That's what I need to understand from Mr. General there, and I don't think we got that in his quote. Here's a quote from the RAND Corporation 2017, written by the Associate Director of Homeland Security. He says, since 2001, almost 40% of the nearly 150 terrorist fatalities in the United States were related to domestic motivations, not jihadi narratives. Focusing attention on one specific form of ideology misses a large share of the threat terrorism poses to Americans and isolates a vast number of American Muslims who reject violence and radical ideology. By addressing the 40%, we require America to confront the issues not only about a religion and faith, but also about patriotism and race. So what this gentleman, the Associate Director of Homeland Security, is saying is that by only focusing on the word Islamic along with terrorism, we cut out all the other kinds of terrorism that pose a threat to America. 40% of the terrorist fatalities in the United States since 2001 have been from non-Muslims. So again, the focus on radical Islamic terrorism has a strategic disadvantage by blinding us to other types of terrorism, as we're excluding it, keeps our allies, moderate Muslim allies, doesn't feed into the terrorist narrative, and does not weaken our ability to gain allies in the war. My opponent hasn't addressed most of these points yet, and basically it does nothing to help actually fight terrorism.
Okay, so with me bringing up the general's quote and what the general was saying, that was going to make the point that the general was saying that so far that everything that the strategy that the U.S. had at that time was failing. One of the strategies that had at that time that was failing was President Obama and his failure to say radical Islamic terrorism. Second, I want to say that everybody knows, if you look at the press conferences and stuff like that, that the big massive amount of applause that Donald Trump got because he was willing to say radical Islamic terrorism, that is to go to show that, yeah, while you can say that I can't definitely show you that, I can say that the voters show that they love Trump and they voted for him. And I can show that majority of the voters, even the Democratic voters, all said that we were at war with radical Islamic terrorism, as opposed to what the president was saying. Now, in this debate, there are points that I've tried to make. So by definition, the word radical describes exactly what Al-Qaeda and ISIS represent to the main body of the Islamic religion. And my opponent hasn't talked about that. In a speech from Obama, when given the reason he did not want to say radical Islamic terrorism, his response almost used the exact definition of the word radical. Then I spoke of the hypocrisy Obama showed during his 8 years, that he did way more to show ISIS and Al-Qaeda as a legitimate threat and rally people to their cause than he could have by saying radical Islamic terrorism. By dropping bombs and blowing up people and killing, had to take my time right quick, and killing civilians, he did more to rally them than he would by saying radical Islamic terrorism. And also that even people from his Democratic Party say by failing to use this term, radical Islamic terrorism, he was failing to show that there's a separation between the mainstream Muslim and those radicalized groups. Also, I've showed you polling data that showed the majority of every political party believed at the time of the election that radical Islamic terrorism was a serious threat. So this goes to actually one of the things of bringing the country together. And I'm not going to get all this in right now. So I'll go ahead and pass. Wait, let me say one more thing. One of the main reasons that cost the Democrats the election and turned blue states red, that had been blue since 1970, is because voters in all parties felt Trump was being honest to the things that bother voter, which was he showed that by being willing to say radical Islamic terrorism. And I'll answer the rest of yours the next turn. So I'll go ahead and pass now.
Sure. Great. So let's go down the list of what was talked about here. Again, yeah, the general says strategy was failing, but how do those words make us fail? He doesn't explain this, just sort of a random opinion that he seems to have. And Obama did pretty well in the war on terror, as you may recall. He killed Osama bin Laden, Saddam Hussein. During his time fighting the war, Obama and his forces were responsible for killing 30 to 33,000 enemy terrorist fighters during the war on terror. So I think it's pretty that Obama somehow failed in this mission. I'm not sure what you expect of him to rid the world of all terrorists. That's not terribly likely, but he fought the war, and he fought it pretty well during his time in office. Now, you mentioned that Trump got applause for saying the words. Yeah, he did. And Trump will say anything to anyone in order to get applause. That's what Trump does. Obama has strategy. He's a strategic-minded person. He says his words very carefully. Now, I researched this topic, and yes, Trump said the words radical Islamic terrorism because he was one of the chief critics of Obama. But you know what he said when he actually went to Saudi Arabia and spoke before our allies? Well, he was very careful not to say radical Islamic terrorism. He praised Muslims. He said Muslims are wonderful people. I love Muslims. He said that those terrorists, they do not worship God, they worship death. That's an exact Trump quote. He was very careful when he was standing before the people of Saudi Arabia to try and say something appeasing and nice to them. But when he went in front of Americans and his diehard fans, he said something to stir their blood, radical Islamic terrorism, and that we're going to keep all the Muslims out of America. That's Trump's MO. That's not what we're here to talk about today. We're talking about Obama. We're talking about strategy in the war on terror. Trump has no direct strategy other than to get applause and get people to like him. Obama has a strategy to fight terrorism, and that's why he chose his words very carefully. Dictionary definitions are not topical to the debate. We're not talking about who was the best thesaurus master. We're talking about who had the best strategy to defeat terrorism and whether these words are implicit in that. We're also not talking about how many bombs were dropped, other than the fact that, yes, Obama was very effective in fighting terrorism. When you're in a war, you drop bombs, you use weapons. That's the way it goes. But there's no need to add insult to injury by using words that would alienate people that you're not dropping bombs on, which is the whole point. And also, the comparison of the effect between bombs and words is, again, not topical. The election, not topical. That's not what we're here to talk about today. We're here to talk about whether or not it's good strategy to say radical Islamic terrorism. You say it fails to show any difference between the different groups. But the point is, actually, Obama emphasizes that in nearly every speech he's made. And I'll read some more quotes from him in another speech to illustrate the fact that he separates regular Islam from radical Islam all the time.
Okay, so first I want to say this. So Obama, the topic is Obama should have used the phrase radical Islamic terrorism as president. And however I go about showing that is however I go about showing it. It doesn't necessarily have to be in winning the war on terror, because as anybody knows that we can say right now, the war on terrorism is still going on. So you can't say that Obama had an overwhelming and he was so victorious, because the war is still going on. So you can't make it about that. You have to make it about the things that we can show. And what we can show is this, that one, like I said, and I guess it kind of sounds like I'm rehashing everything over again. So it's not about, you can't say about whether it was just military strategy and stuff like that, because that's not in the topic of the debate. It has to be on what I show as reasons, whether I have valid reasons why Obama should have used the phrase radical Islamic terrorism. And I believe I've showed that. One, because it makes sense, because like I said, the very definition of radical is the very definition that he used verbatim to explain why he didn't say radical Islamic terrorism. Next, I showed you that a congresswoman and also an Iraq veteran said that there was error in not saying it because it failed to separate mainstream from those radical. Then I showed you a general that said the Obama strategy that he had, part of that was failing to say radical Islamic terrorism, showed strategic error in showing that. And I'm going to run out of time. Okay, so please watch the rest of the things I said already again to see what else I was trying to make. And with that being said, hey, it's been a pleasure, Siegfried.
Debate, you've got to have some kind of criteria to measure on. I've given a very clear criteria, which is whether or not the words radical Islamic terrorism are a good strategy, a wise strategy in pursuing the. You didn't really argue against it until the very last moment, which is a little bit late. So you need to give us an alternate criteria if you want us to judge on one, but we don't have one. So that's the criteria in this debate. Is a good strategy. I've shown you why it's good strategy, because using those words could alienate moderate Islam, and we've talked about why that is. It feeds into the terrorist narrative, and we've discussed why it feeds into the terrorist narrative. It weakens our ability to gain allies. We have 86 nations, including 18 Muslim nations, that are our allies. Obama did that by being diplomatic and careful and strategic in his use of words. And it does nothing to fight the war on terror. Just saying radical Islamic terrorism, Trump said it. Did all the terrorists go away? No. Are we winning the war on terror? Not any more than we used to be. So